Let's start with a question that's really easy to ask, but as it turns out, very difficult to answer, and that is, how competitive is teacher pay? In educational reform circles, teacher compensation has long been cited as a major challenge that can hamper efforts to strengthen the teaching profession. The conventional wisdom is that teachers are not paid as well as workers in comparable occupations, and as a result, the argument goes, it can be difficult to attract the best and brightest into teaching in the first place, and that may be particularly true for people with a background in, say, math and science, where private sector salaries can be very lucrative. But it also matters for veteran teachers. Salaries may be a factor that can help keep a good, effective, experienced teacher in the job as opposed to changing careers. So that's a conventional wisdom, and it does receive support from some research. However, as is often the case, there are also other studies that contradict those findings. Now, when you look at the research literature, at the root of many of those discrepancies are methodological differences between the studies, such as whether teachers are considered 9-month workers, whether benefits are analyzed alongside of salaries, and exactly how pay should be measured in a more technical sense. While we do know something about the teacher compensation picture nationally, very little is known from state to state, and that's a major gap in our understanding here. There's also a more fundamental and, in my view, probably more important issue to consider here, though. That is, if we're asking how well are teachers paid, we also need to ask compared to whom. Analyzing teacher compensation is a little bit like analyzing the real estate market. So if you're buying or selling a house, you want to know what comparable properties the comps are going for so you know what a fair price is. The same thing applies to teachers. Here, we need to identify a comparison group, a set of jobs or occupations that can serve as a relevant point of comparison for teachers. Some of the unsettled nature of the research on this particular issue, I think, can be traced to very different comparison groups across studies of teacher compensation. Sometimes analysts compare teachers to classic professions, like doctors and lawyers. Sometimes it's workers with a certain level of education, maybe a bachelor's or master's degree. Sometimes it's a labor force as a whole, which includes very low and very high paid jobs. And as you can imagine, you get a very different answer when you compare teacher pay to these three different types of workers. So when we approached the issue of defining the comps for our own study, we adapted an approach using a recent study by the Economic Policy Institute, or EPI. And that study identified a set of 16 occupations with skill demands on the job that are similar to those of teachers. So you can see the occupations listed here on the screen. We're talking about workers here like accountants, counselors, physical and occupational therapists, and registered nurses. Just on its face, this list struck us as a very appropriate point of comparison for teachers, and I'd also add that if you're interested in the details of the EPI study, I personally found its empirical rationale very compelling, and so I'd recommend that study to you as well. One of the features that sets our study apart from other research on teacher compensation is the data we use. We use the American Community Survey, which is a very large sample survey. It's a U.S. Census Bureau database that captures millions of people nationwide. It contains a wealth of information, most notably for our purposes, data on a person's educational level, occupation, and earnings. And I'll note here that we can look at earnings, but the ACS, American Community Survey, does not have information about benefits. Now, the ACS is big, but we actually needed it to be bigger. So we combined 2 years of data from 2005 and 2006, and that gave us information on literally millions of workers across America. This in turn allowed us to do a couple things that past research hasn't been able to do. First, we can isolate public K-12 school teachers specifically, which is very hard to do in other studies. And more to the point, we can also take a national analysis and drill it down to the state level to give a state-by-state perspective on the issue. And that's a unique feature of this research. So what did we find? Well, to begin with, the big 30,000-foot view, the typical K-12 school teacher in the nation earns close to $45,000 a year, compared with nearly $51,000 for the workers in those comparable 16 occupations. That's a gap of about $6,100 in annual earnings. And that's a substantial disparity when we're looking at salaries at this level. Now, 2 other points of comparison here just to offer a little bit of context. Teachers earn about $8,000 more annually than the average worker in the labor force, which again includes very low and very high paying jobs. But the average worker with a bachelor's degree earns more than both teachers and workers in those 16 comparable occupations. So that's kind of interesting, or at least we think it is. But the real question is, how can we quantify the competitiveness of teacher pay? And to do that, we created what we call a pay parity index. And it's a really simple calculation. You take the earnings of teachers, divide those by the pay in the comparable occupations, and that's your index here. And so nationally, you can see the calculation there. We get a value of 88. What that means is that the average public school teacher in the nation earns 88 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned in comparable occupations. That's a national picture, but what's happening across the states? As is true in much of our work at Education Week and the EPE Research Center, we find that national statistics often mask a tremendous amount of state-to-state variation, and this is not an exception. We find that in states with the least competitive compensation, which would be Missouri and North Carolina, teachers earn less than 88% of what comparable workers in those 16 occupations do. At the opposite end of the spectrum, in Montana and Rhode Island, teacher salaries are at least 10% higher than those in the other occupations, and overall 10 states either reach or surpass the parity line for teacher pay. And I'll just add here that what we're looking at is teachers in particular states compared with those other 16 occupations in the same state. This is all within state analysis. So I'd like to share briefly just one other major finding from the teacher pay analysis, because I think it really speaks to some of the challenges that the profession faces for keeping the best and brightest in teaching. So let's look at the distribution of wages for our 16 comparable occupations. What we see here is a pretty normal-looking bell curve. Peaks around the median level, slips gradually down on either side. But here's what the distribution of pay looks like for teachers. Now, not to split hairs or get too technical, but that's a pretty pointy-looking distribution here, much more so than the other occupations. So what does this mean? What this tells us is that pay is much more tightly constrained in teaching than it is in comparable occupations. Teacher salaries tend to fall very close to the median level, typically. So teachers are less likely to earn very low salaries, that's the good news, but the trade-off there is that teachers are also much more likely to earn competitive salaries if we're thinking about something maybe in the $100,000 a year range. Very few teachers are seeing salaries at that level. So if I've done my job here, I've piqued your interest in our teacher pay analysis. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions for the Q&A, but as I mentioned before, a lot of ground to cover, so strap on the track shoes.